Got a lot quieter in here.
I don't think it's too hot today.
All right, we're going to begin in about a minute, well, 30 seconds or so. Please ensure your cell phones are off or on silent, and council members ensure your microphone's turned off. Also, before we begin, from the comments from last week about the audio, if we can just speak a little louder or into the mics a little more. All right, good evening. This is a regular legislative meeting of Barberton City Council. Today is Monday, September 11th, 2023. It is 6 p.m. Before we begin the regular legislative meeting, we do have individual committee meetings this evening, so we will start with street, sidewalk, and lighting with Mrs. Angela. Oh, I'm sorry, hold on. What am I looking at here?
Making it up again.
You're all right, I'm looking at the wrong one here. City properties, parks with Mr. Jaber.
Thank you, Mr. President. City Properties Park Recreation, September 11th at 6:02. Location, council chambers. Members present, including myself as chair, Mr. Heidig, Mrs. Fry. Other council members also noted and guests also noted. We have one new request legislation. A letter from Mrs. Lisa Miller requesting legislation authorizing the mayor to remove the contained deed to the Armory property located at 666 Norton Avenue. Emergency rewarding requested. We had also attached letter to it. Any questions or concerns? Mrs. Miller is here. Do you have any questions? Good.
Thank you, Chair. I do have like one question. It's more out of curiosity. If the property is owned by the community foundation currently, as a not owner, are we able to remove the covenants off of the deed?
We're the only ones who can remove the covenants
Okay.
because we're the person with the covenants.
Okay, awesome. Thank you, Mrs. Miller. Thank you, Chair.
Any other questions or concerns? Seeing none, motion please.
I'll make that motion.
And I'll second it.
And vote please.
Aye.
Aye.
All right, thank you. We have no pending legislation and open this up to miscellaneous discussion. Seeing none. Audience? All right, thank you. Motion to adjourn, please.
I'll make a motion to adjourn.
I will second that.
Thank you. And we adjourned at 6:03. I'm sorry, my time before was 6:01 we started.
Awesome. Thank you, Mr. Jaber. Next up is public welfare and safety with Mrs. Frye.
Thank you, Mr. President. It is 6:03 p.m. and I am bringing the Public Welfare and Safety Committee meeting to order. It is Monday, September 11, 2023. We are located in chambers, council chambers. All members of the committee are present, which is myself as chair, Mr. Griffin, and Mrs. Coburn. All other council members are present, as well as guests, as noted on my sheet. We have a request for legislation from Stephen Iono, Chief of Barberton Fire Department, requesting legislation approving a purchase from Fire Safety Services Incorporated in the amount of $15,037.04 of a Quick Check 3 fit tester. The MSA air supply fit tester is to assure that the air supply masks are fitted correctly for use during firefighting and hazardous conditions. Emergency wording was requested, and this will be referred to finance. Do I have any questions about this particular piece of legislation?
I have none.
All right, hearing none, do I have a motion to call for it?
So moved.
Thank you, Mr. Griffin.
I'll second.
Mr. Griffin made a motion to call for it, and it was seconded by Mrs. Coburn. All in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Aye. It passes unanimously. That is the only piece of legislation that was requested tonight. We also have pending legislation which we will be voting on. And that is legislation requested by Mrs. Eisman, Director of Public Safety, to update and assure compliance in the municipal parking lots, Chapter 355. And also a letter from Steve Iona, the chief of the Barberton Fire Department, requesting a resolution to honor and commend Fireman William J. Hogue. Mr. Hogue will be having a retirement party on September the 23rd, and I got a message that he might be here on the 18th to receive his resolution, but it hadn't been confirmed yet. Now I'll open up for miscellaneous discussion. Does anybody have any comments or questions for safety and public welfare? Mr. Heidick.
Thank you, Chair. If I may address Director Eisman there? Director, did you give any thought to the application process for the exemptions in the parking lots? To have something that, for instance, with a road closure file, you give a certificate. If somebody applied to park something that would be accepted from here, that they could run their windshields so our law enforcement could easily identify which cars have been cleared to park there?
I'm working on that, but it's up to
Thank you very much. Thank you.
You're welcome. All right, any other questions or comments? Hearing none, do I have a motion to adjourn?
I'll make that motion.
Motion made by Mrs. Coburn and seconded by Mr. Griffin. And we are adjourned at 6:07 PM. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Fry. Next up is Rules Marketing Development, Mr. Griffin.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'd like to call the meeting to order. Today is September 9th. We are meeting in 9/11, yes. We're meeting in council chambers, all members present and all others noted. Tonight we have no request for legislation. Do we have any miscellaneous discussion or anything for rules, marketing, and development? No. The gallery? Hearing none, do I have a motion to adjourn?
I'll make that motion.
Thank you, Mrs. Thompson.
I will second that.
Thank you. We are adjourned at 6:06. With that, I pass.
Thank you, Mr. Griffin. Next up, City Utilities with Mrs. Coburn.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'd like to call City Utilities to order at 6:09 PM. We have one request for legislation, a letter from Michael Teodecki, city engineer, requesting legislation to enter into contract with Kavanaugh Construction in the amount of $61,897.50 for the reconstruction of a 24-inch storm sewer, 10-foot deep, that is failing on Hopkins Avenue. Emergency wording is requested. Did everyone get a copy of the request? Seems pretty reasonable. We don't want a 10-foot hole in the middle of Hopkins. Are there any questions about this? Hearing none, do I have a...
I will make a
Thank you,
motion.
Mrs. Fry.
I'll second that.
Thank you. We had, Mrs. Fry made a motion and Erica Bailey seconded it. All in favor?
Aye.
We do have some things we're voting on tonight, don't we?
Yes,
We
I
have,
believe we do.
we had a bunch of pending for applications for funds to 5 or 6 different organizations that would lend or loan or grants for the water department. And I don't, here it is. We have the letter from, I found it, thank you very much. Engineer requesting to allow the mayor for funding opportunities not limited to ODNR H2O, Ohio, PWM, HMGP, and other such funding, and emergency wording is requested for that. We have a letter from Dennis Weaver, the Utilities Director, requesting legislation authorizing a change order in the amount of $237,290.67. We're just moving this money from one place to another in that job, that's what a change order is. And that's all I have. Is there any miscellaneous remarks from anybody, from the audience? Okay, do I have a motion to adjourn?
I will make a motion to adjourn.
I'll second that.
Thank you very much. We will adjourn at 6:13.
Thank you, Mrs. Coburn. Last but not least, Finance and Personnel with Mr. Heidick.
Thank you, Mr. President. Finance and Personnel, it is Monday, September 11th, 2023 at 6:14. All members of the committee are present, which include Councilors Coburn, Thompson, President Greer, with myself as chair. All others are noted. This is a legislative night, so we do not have requests. The financial report for August of 2023 will be next week, as Director Flaker is on vacation. And pending, we have quite a few. The first one is Eberhart Landscaping and Lawn Services Incorporated CRA abatement. Are there any questions on this? Nope. Next is an appropriation for the Law Department for laptop computer. Any questions here? Next is certifying property tax rates. Any comments? Next, advance of local taxes. Anything? Next is authorized payment for Toshiba copier. Any comments? And finally, authorizing payment to Insight Advisory. Any comments on that? Right. Does anybody have any miscellaneous discussion? Seeing none, do I have a motion to adjourn?
I'll make that motion.
Thank you.
I'll second.
Thank you. We are adjourned at 6:15.
Thank you, Mr. Heidick. That concludes our individual committee meetings for this evening. Being it's only been 15 minutes since we started, is there any objection to kind of just roll right into the regular legislative? All right, well, I do have a personal one. I have to go check the list, so just give me 30 seconds.
Go ahead and roll it. A difference from last week.
I forgot about those 3-hour meetings we used to have. Gee. I don't think I didn't have it. I just happened to have my other. I know. Yeah, I just happened to have my other report from
So did
last
I.
week. Yeah, that's the only way I had
But
it.
we used to get it.
Yeah, I know. I know.
All right. This is a regular legislative meeting for the Barberton City Council. Today is Monday, September 11th, 2023. I call this meeting to order at 6:15 p.m. Please stand for the Pledge of Allegiance, followed by invocation by myself. I pledge allegiance
To the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
As we begin this evening, we give thanks to the men and women that gave their life serving our country and communities. I also want to take this moment to show reverence for those that gave everything in the line of duty protecting the well-being of our community, our country, our values, and our rights that are afforded to each one of us. Lord, I ask that you help us heal but never let us forget. Be the constant beacon that we must remember to embrace one another, help where we can, and be open-minded and respectful to differences. We are one through your eyes. In your name I pray. Amen.
Amen.
All right, clerk, please call the roll.
President Greer.
Present.
Mr. Heidick.
Here.
Mrs. Thompson.
Here.
Mrs. Bailey.
Here.
Mrs. Angela.
Here.
Mr. Griffin.
Here.
Mr. Jaber.
Here.
Mrs. Coburn.
Here.
Mrs. Fry.
Here.
Thank you. Approval of the minutes. Is there a motion to approve the minutes for the regular legislative meeting held on Monday, July 24th, 2023? Mr. Heidick?
Thank you, Mr. President. I move to approve the minutes of the regular legislative meeting from Monday, July 24th, 2023.
Thank you. Is there a second? Mrs. Thompson?
Thank you, Mr. President. I'd like to second Mr. Heidick's motion to approve the minutes from Monday, July 24th, 2023.
Thank you. It was moved by Mr. Heidick and seconded by Mrs. Thompson to approve the minutes of the regular legislative meeting held on Monday, July 24th, 2023, as presented. Are there any remarks? All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? Minutes are adopted. Finance report. Is there a motion to accept the Finance Department report for the month of July 2023 as presented? Mr. Heidick.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move to accept the Finance Department report for the month of July 2023.
Thank you. Second, Mrs. Coburn.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'll second that motion for acceptance.
Thank you. It was moved by Mr. Heidick and seconded by Mrs. Coburn to accept the financial report for the month of July, 2023 as presented. Are there any remarks? All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? Financial report is adopted. Petitions and claims.
We have none.
Thank you. Matters requested.
They have all been dispersed.
Thank you. Citizens addressing council. There are none. First reading of ordinances and resolutions.
Ordinance number 111-2023, presented by Mrs. Fry. Title, amending Barberton Codified Ordinances, Chapter 355, Municipal Parking Lots. An ordinance amending Section 355.01, designation, ordinance number 199-1993, and Section 355.02, use of lots, ordinance number 192-1991, ordinance number 7-2001, and ordinance number 54-2018, and declaring an emergency.
Thank you. Motion to suspend, Mrs. Fry.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move that the rule is required by Section 5.10 of the Barberton City Charter be suspended.
Thank you. Mr. Griffin.
Thank you, Mr. President. I would like to second Mrs. Fry's motion on suspension.
Thank you. A motion was made by Mrs. Fry and seconded by Mr. Griffin to suspend the rule as required by Section 5.10 of the Barberton City Charter. Are there any remarks? Clerk, please call the roll on suspension.
Mrs. Angela.
Yes.
Mrs. Coburn.
Yes.
Mrs. Thompson.
Yes.
Mrs. Fry.
Yes.
Mrs. Bailey.
Yes.
Mr. Griffin.
Yes.
Mr. Heidick.
Yes.
Mr. Jaber.
Yes.
Thank you. Motion for suspension carries. Motion to adopt, Mrs. Fry.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move for the adoption of ordinance number 111-2023.
Thank you. Mr. Griffin.
Thank you, Mr. President. I would like to second Mrs. Fry's motion on adoption.
Thank you. A motion was made by Mrs. Fry and seconded by Mr. Griffin to adopt ordinance number 111-2023. Are there any remarks? Clerk, please call the roll on adoption.
Mr. Jaber.
Yes.
Mr. Heidick.
Yes.
Mr. Griffin.
Yes.
Mrs. Bailey.
Yes.
Mrs. Fry.
Yes.
Mrs. Thompson.
Yes.
Mrs. Coburn.
Yes.
Mrs. Angela.
Yes.
Motion for adoption carries.
Ordinance number 112-2023, presented by Mrs. Thompson and Mr. Heidick. Title, Everhart Landscaping and Lawn Service Incorporated, CRA abatement. An ordinance authorizing the mayor via the planning director to submit to the state of Ohio a business application for tax incentives on behalf of Everhart Landscaping and Lawn Services Incorporated for a 100% 15-year tax abatement for the business expansion improvements to 5205 New Haven Circle and declaring an emergency.
Thank you. Motion to suspend, Mrs. Thompson.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move that the rule is required by Section 5.10 of the Barberton City Charter be suspended.
Thank you. Mr. Heide?
Thank you, Mr. President. I will second Counselor Thompson's motion to suspend.
Thank you. A motion was made by Mrs. Thompson and second by Mr. Heidick to suspend the rule as required by Section 5.10 of the Barberton City Charter. Are there any remarks? Clerk, please call the roll on suspension.
Mrs. Bailey?
Yes.
Mrs. Fry?
Yes.
Mrs. Angela?
Yes.
Mr. Heidick?
Yes.
Mr. Jaber?
Yes.
Mrs. Thompson?
Yes.
Mr. Griffin?
Yes.
Mrs. Coburn?
Yes.
Motion for suspension carries. Motion to adopt, Mrs. Thompson.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move for the adoption of ordinance number 112-2023.
Thank you. And Mr. Heidick?
Thank you, Mr. President. I will second the motion to adopt.
Thank you. A motion was made by Mrs. Thompson and second by Mr. Heidick to adopt ordinance number 112-2023. Are there any remarks? Clerk, please call the roll on adoption.
Mrs. Coburn?
Yes.
Mr. Griffin?
Yes.
Mrs. Thompson?
Yes.
Mr. Jaber?
Yes.
Mr. Heidick?
Yes.
Mrs. Angela?
Yes.
Mrs. Fry?
Yes.
Mrs. Bailey?
Yes.
Motion for adoption carries.
Ordinance number 113-2023, presented by Mr. Heidick. Title, Appropriation Law Department. An ordinance appropriating $2,000 from the unappropriated item of the Law Enforcement Trust Fund to the operation and maintenance budget of the Law Department to buy a laptop for a prosecutor and declaring an emergency.
Thank you. Motion to suspend, Mr. Heidick.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move that the rule required by Section 5.10 of the Barberton City Charter be suspended.
Thank you. And Mrs. Coburn?
Thank you, Mr. President. I'd like to second Mr. Heidick's motion for a suspension.
Thank you. A motion was made by Mr. Heidick and second by Mrs. Coburn to suspend the rule as required by Section 5.10 of the Barberton City Charter. Are there any remarks? Clerk, please call the roll on suspension.
Mr. Jaber?
Yes.
Mrs. Thompson?
Yes.
Mrs. Fry?
Yes.
Mrs. Coburn?
Yes.
Mr. Heidick?
Yes.
Mrs. Bailey?
Yes.
Mrs. Angela?
Yes.
Mr. Griffin?
Yes.
Motion for suspension carries. Motion to adopt, Mr. Heidick.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move to adopt ordinance 113-2023.
Thank you. Mrs. Coburn?
Thank you, Mr. President. I'd like to second that motion for adoption.
Thank you. A motion was made by Mr. Heidick and seconded by Mrs. Coburn to adopt ordinance number 113-2023. Are there any remarks? Clerk, please call the roll on adoption.
Mr. Griffin?
Yes.
Mrs. Angela?
Yes.
Mrs. Bailey?
Yes.
Mr. Heidick?
Yes.
Mrs. Coburn?
Yes.
Mrs. Fry?
Yes.
Mrs. Thompson?
Yes.
Mr. Jaber?
Yes.
Motion for adoption carries.
Resolution number 114-2023, presented by Mr. Heidick. Title, Certifying Property Taxes. A resolution accepting the amounts and rates of property tax as determined by the Budget Commission of Summit County and authorizing the necessary tax levies and certifying them to the Summit County Auditor for the year 2024 and declaring emergency.
Thank you. Motion to suspend, Mr. Heidick.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move that the rule required by Section 5.10 of the Barberton City Charter be suspended.
Thank you. And Mrs. Coburn?
Thank you, Mr. President. I'd like to second that motion on suspension.
Thank you. A motion was made by Mr. Heidick and seconded by Mrs. Coburn to suspend the rule as required by Section 5.10 of the Barberton City Charter. Are there any remarks? Clerk, please call the roll on suspension.
Mr. Jaber?
Yes.
Mr. Heidick?
Yes.
Mr. Griffin?
Yes.
Mrs. Angela?
Yes.
Mrs. Thompson?
Yes.
Mrs. Coburn?
Yes.
Mrs. Bailey?
Yes.
Mrs. Fry?
Yes.
Motion for suspension carries. Motion to adopt, Mr. Heidick.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move to adopt Resolution 114-2023.
Thank you. Mrs. Coburn?
Thank you, Mr. President. I'd like to second that motion for adoption.
Thank you. Motion was made by Mr. Heidick and seconded by Mrs. Coburn to adopt Resolution 114-2023. Are there any remarks? Clerk, please call the roll on adoption.
Mrs. Fry?
Yes.
Mrs. Bailey?
Yes.
Mrs. Coburn?
Yes.
Mrs. Thompson?
Yes.
Mrs. Angela?
Yes.
Mr. Griffin?
Yes.
Mr. Heidick?
Yes.
Mr. Jaber?
Yes.
Motion for adoption carries.
Resolution number 115-2023, presented by Mr. Heidick. Title, Advance of Local Taxes. A resolution of the Council of the City of Barberton authorizing the advance of local taxes by the County Fiscal Office for the 2023 tax year payable in 2024 and declaring an emergency.
Thank you. Motion to suspend, Mr. Heidick.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move that the rule required by Section 5.10 of the Barberton City Charter be suspended.
Thank you. Mrs. Coburn?
Thank you, Mr. President. I'd like to second that motion on suspension.
Thank you. A motion was made by Mr. Heidick and seconded by Mrs. Coburn to suspend the rule as required by Section 5.10 of the Barberton City Charter. Are there any remarks? Clerk, please call the roll on suspension.
Mr. Heidick.
Yes.
Mrs. Coburn.
Yes.
Mrs. Thompson.
Yes.
Mrs. Bailey.
Yes.
Mr. Griffin.
Yes.
Mr. Jaber.
Yes.
Mrs. Fry.
Yes.
Mrs. Angela.
Yes.
Motion for suspension carries. Motion to adopt, Mr. Heidick.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move to adopt Resolution 115, 2023.
Thank you. Mrs. Coburn?
Thank you, Mr. President. I'd like to second that motion on adoption.
Thank you. A motion was made by Mr. Heidick and seconded by Mrs. Coburn to adopt Resolution 115-2023. Are there any remarks? Clerk, please call the roll on adoption.
Mrs. Angela.
Yes.
Mrs. Fry.
Yes.
Mr. Jaber.
Yes.
Mr. Griffin.
Yes.
Mrs. Bailey.
Yes.
Mrs. Thompson.
Yes.
Mrs. Coburn.
Yes.
Mr. Heidick.
Yes.
Motion for adoption carries.
Ordinance number 116-2023, presented by Mr. Heidick. Title, Authorized Payment, Toshiba Copier. An ordinance authorizing the Director of Finance to approve a payment not to exceed $7,000 to U.S. Bank Equipment Finance for a buyout for a Toshiba copier and declaring an emergency.
Thank you. Motion to suspend, Mr. Heidick.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move that the rule required by Section 5.10 of the Barberton City Charter be suspended.
Thank you. Mrs. Coburn?
Thank you, Mr. President. I'd like to second that motion.
Thank you. A motion was made by Mr. Heidick and seconded by Mrs. Coburn to suspend the rule as required by Section 5.10 of the Barberton City Charter. Are there any remarks? Clerk, please call the roll on suspension.
Mrs. Bailey?
Yes.
Mr. Jaber?
Yes.
Mrs. Coburn?
Yes.
Mrs. Angela?
Yes.
Mrs. Fry?
Yes.
Mr. Griffin?
Yes.
Mr. Heidick?
Yes.
Mrs. Thompson?
Yes.
Motion for suspension carries. Motion to adopt, Mr. Heidick.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move to adopt Ordinance 116, 2023.
Thank you. Mrs. Coburn?
Thank you, Mr. President. I'd like to second that motion for adoption.
Thank you. A motion was made by Mr. Heidick and seconded by Mrs. Coburn to adopt ordinance number 116-2023. Are there any remarks? Clerk, please call the roll on adoption.
Mrs. Thompson?
Yes.
Mr. Heidick?
Yes.
Mr. Griffin?
Yes.
Mrs. Fry?
Yes.
Mrs. Angela?
Yes.
Mrs. Coburn?
Yes.
Mr. Jaber?
Yes.
Mrs. Bailey?
Yes.
Motion for adoption carries.
Ordinance number 117-2023, presented by Mr. Heidick. Title, Authorized Payment Insight Advisory Group, LLC. An ordinance authorizing the Director of Finance to approve a payment in the amount of $3,500 to Insight Advisory Group, LLC, for services provided for economic development and declaring an emergency.
Thank you. Motion to suspend, Mr. Heidick.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move that the rule required by Section 5.10 of the Barberton City Charter be suspended.
Thank you. And Mrs. Coburn?
Thank you, Mr. President. I'd like to second that motion on suspension.
Thank you. A motion was made by Mr. Heidick and seconded by Mrs. Coburn to suspend the rule as required by Section 5.10 of the Barberton City Charter. Are there any remarks? Clerk, please call the roll on suspension.
Mrs. Angela?
Yes.
Mr. Jaber?
Yes.
Mrs. Bailey?
Yes.
Mr. Griffin?
Yes.
Mrs. Coburn?
Yes.
Mrs. Fry?
Yes.
Mrs. Thompson?
Yes.
Mr. Heidick?
Yes.
Motion for suspension carries. Motion to adopt, Mr. Heidick.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move to adopt Ordinance 117, 2023.
Thank you. Mrs. Coburn?
Thank you, Mr. President. I'd like to second Mr. Heidick's motion for adoption.
Thank you. A motion was made by Mr. Heidick and seconded by Mrs. Coburn to adopt ordinance number 117-2023. Are there any remarks? Clerk, please call the roll on adoption.
Mr. Heidick?
Yes.
Mrs. Thompson?
Yes.
Mrs. Fry?
Yes.
Mrs. Coburn?
Yes.
Mr. Griffin?
Yes.
Mrs. Bailey?
Yes.
Mr. Jaber?
Yes.
Mrs. Angela?
Yes.
Thank you. Motion for adoption carries.
Resolution number 118-2023, presented by Mrs. Coburn. Title, Grant Application, ODNR, H2 Ohio, PWM-HMGP. A resolution authorizing the mayor to apply for funding opportunities, including but not limited to ODNR H2 Ohio, PWM, HMGP, and other such funding, and declaring an emergency.
Thank you. Motion to suspend, Mrs. Coburn.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move that the rule as required by Section 5.10 of the Barberton City Charter be suspended.
Thank you. And Mrs. Fry?
Thank you, Mr. President. I second Mrs. Coburn's motion to suspend.
Thank you. Motion was made by Mrs. Coburn and seconded by Mrs. Fry to suspend the rule as required by Section 5.10 of the Barberton City Charter. Are there any remarks? Clerk, please call the roll on suspension.
Mr. Griffin?
Yes.
Mrs. Angela?
Yes.
Mr. Heidick?
Yes.
Mr. Jaber?
Yes.
Mrs. Frog?
Yes.
Mrs. Bailey?
Yes.
Mrs. Coburn?
Yes.
Mrs. Thompson?
Yes.
Motion for suspension carries. Motion to adopt, Mrs. Coburn.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move for the adoption of ordinance number 118-2023.
Thank you. Mrs. Fry?
Thank you, Mr. President. I second Mrs. Coburn's motion to adopt resolution number 118-2023.
Thank you. A motion was made by Mrs. Coburn and seconded by Mrs. Fry to adopt resolution number 118-2023. Are there any remarks? Clerk, please call the roll on adoption.
Mrs. Thompson?
Yes.
Mrs. Coburn?
Yes.
Mrs. Bailey?
Yes.
Mrs. Frog?
Yes.
Mr. Jaber?
Yes.
Mr. Heidick?
Yes.
Mrs. Angela?
Yes.
Mr. Griffin?
Yes.
Thank you. Motion for adoption carries.
Resolution number 119-2023, presented by Mrs. Frog. Excuse me. Title, Commendation, William J. Hogue. A resolution of the Council of the City of Barberton to honor and give public recognition to firefighter William J. Hogue for his 29 years of dedicated service to the City of Barberton Fire Department and to this community.
All right. Is that an emergency?
Nope.
All right. Motion to suspend, Mrs. Fry.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move that the rule is required by Section 5.10 of the Barberton City Charter be suspended.
Thank you. Mr. Griffin?
Thank you, Mr. President. I would like to second Mrs. Fry's motion on suspension.
Thank you. A motion was made by Mrs. Fry and seconded by Mr. Griffin to suspend the rule as required by Section 5.10 of the Barberton City Charter. Are there any remarks? Clerk, please call the roll on suspension.
Mrs. Frog?
Yes.
Mr. Heidick?
Yes.
Mrs. Bailey?
Yes.
Mrs. Thompson?
Yes.
Mrs. Angela?
Yes.
Mr. Jaber?
Yes.
Mr. Griffin?
Yes.
Mrs. Coburn?
Yes.
Motion for suspension carries. Motion to adopt, Mrs. Fry.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move for the adoption of resolution number 119-2023.
Thank you. Mr. Griffin?
Thank you, Mr. President. I would like to second Mrs. Fry's motion on adoption.
Thank you. A motion was made by Mrs. Fry and seconded by Mr. Griffin to adopt resolution 119-2023. Are there any remarks? Clerk, please call the roll on adoption.
Mrs. Coburn?
Yes.
Mr. Griffin?
Yes.
Mr. Jaber?
Yes.
Mrs. Angela?
Yes.
Mrs. Thompson?
Yes.
Mrs. Bailey?
Yes.
Mr. Heidick?
Yes.
Mrs. Frog?
Yes.
Motion for adoption carries.
Ordinance number 120-2023, presented by Mrs. Coburn. Title, Change Order, North Bay Construction Incorporated. An ordinance authorizing a change order in the amount of $237,290.67 with North Bay Construction Incorporated to provide a bulk water filling station with backflow protection for the water distribution system at the wastewater treatment plant and declaring an emergency.
Thank you. Motion to suspend, Mrs. Coburn.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move that the rule as required by Section 5.10 of the Barberton City Charter be suspended.
Thank you. Mrs. Fry?
Thank you, Mr. President. I will second Mrs. Coburn's motion to suspend.
Thank you. Motion was made by Mrs. Coburn and seconded by Mrs. Fry to suspend the rule as required by Section 5.10 of the Barberton City Charter. Are there any remarks? Clerk, please call the roll on suspension.
Mrs. Bailey?
Yes.
Mrs. Fry?
Yes.
Mrs. Angela?
Yes.
Mr. Heidick?
Yes.
Mr. Jaber?
Yes.
Mrs. Thompson?
Yes.
Mr. Griffin?
Yes.
Mrs. Coburn?
Yes.
Motion for suspension carries. Motion to adopt, Mrs. Coburn.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move for the adoption of ordinance number 120-2023.
Thank you. Mrs. Fry?
Thank you, Mr. President. I second Mrs. Coburn's motion to adopt.
Thank you. A motion was made by Mrs. Coburn and seconded by Mrs. Fry to adopt ordinance number 120-2023. Are there any remarks? Clerk, please call the roll on adoption.
Mrs. Coburn?
Yes.
Mr. Griffin?
Yes.
Mrs. Thompson?
Yes.
Mr. Jaber?
Yes.
Mr. Heidick?
Yes.
Mrs. Angela?
Yes.
Mrs. Fry?
Yes.
Mrs. Bailey?
Yes.
Motion for adoption passes.
This ends the first reading.
Second reading of ordinances and resolutions.
We have none.
Third reading of ordinances and resolutions.
We have none.
Miscellaneous and unfinished business.
We had a liquor license that came in, these two came in during the break. It's a new liquor license, a D5, to the VFW Post 1066 in Barberton at 75 6th Street Northwest. Letters were sent out and I received no objections, so it was returned certified mail with no hearing requested on August 21st. We had a transfer came in to Kit Nails and Spa LLC, doing business as Kit Nail and Spa, at 186 Worcester Road North, Unit 11B, that's in the Plaza, Barberton. It is a D2, it is a transfer from Rose Nails LLC, doing business as MINH BINH Nugent, at 189 Worcester Road, same address. Again, letters were sent out, we received no objections, the license was returned certified mail with no hearing requested on August 21st, 2023.
Thank you. Is there any other miscellaneous or unfinished business? Mrs. Angela?
Mr. President, I probably would want to address this to Mr. Heidick. What is the new D5? What's the D5?
D5 is Monday through Saturday, beer, wine, and hard liquor from 5 a.m., I believe, until 2:30 a.m. And,
It has gambling involved, I looked it up.
well, I'm getting to that one.
Okay.
And it has limited Sunday privileges, but a D5 also gives the ability within the state now to acquire sports betting on premise.
Sports betting, okay. And then D2.
D2 is what would be considered wine and low-proof spirits. So any beer has a limit to the percentage classification by the state. Anything between that percentage and the 42% is considered D2. So anything you could buy at the drive-through, wine, low-proof liquor, once you clear 43, then it goes into the hard liquor category. So mixed drinks that are already pre-packaged, like mudslides or margaritas that normally you would need hard liquor to serve, the pre-packaged ones fall under that as well.
That's
So on this one, you could be having your nails done and have wine or a margarita.
That's
She's
why I asked.
excited.
It's actually, I've seen throughout the country, it's actually getting pretty popular with nail salons to be able to have, they can't serve beer or hard liquor, those would be different licenses, but I've seen around the country nail places getting that so they can offer that kind of amenity to their clients while they're sitting there.
I like it. Thank you, thank you.
Is there any other
Get a
miscellaneous?
mimosa.
Yep.
Communication from the body, is there anything from council? Anything from department heads? Pete?
Hi, Pete.
Yes, I would
Sorry.
like to say that the planning commission for September has been moved. It is this Wednesday, in fact. That was decided upon in our July meeting in order to make quorum.
Sorry, what was the date on that?
I said that'll be September 13th.
13th?
Yes.
September 13th? All right. Is there anything else from department heads? I just have one thing. Next meeting will be September 18th, 6 p.m. here. That will be a committee of the whole meeting. Communication from the mayor.
Thank you, Mr. President. I don't know. Councilman Heidick, you didn't realize you were being tested tonight, did you? First, I want to thank the Barberton Fire Department and everyone who attended today's 9/11 ceremony this morning. Paying tribute to those who perished is the least that we can do. Our safety forces are so vital to the sanctity of our community, and we're very lucky to have the safety forces that we have here. So it's great to see so many people out at the ceremony this morning. So let us never forget. This past Friday and Saturday, Habitat for Humanity held a Barberton Neighborhood Reborn. I thank Councilman Griffin for being there as well. So through the Barberton Community Needs Assessment, they chose that area, the South Barberton area, College, George, Frank, and Snyder, and Harder Streets. So a little recap on that. There were different home repairs that were done, general landscaping, 20 solar-powered motion security lights that were installed. Some safety resources like small fire-resistant safes, first aid kits, things of that nature that were passed out. 45 homes received a door drop with community resources on their front porch. Thank you to the fire department who installed smoke detectors and CO detectors in homes. A lot of waste disposal, whether that was grass or old shrubbery or things of that nature. And there was quite a few volunteers there. So Barberton residents from the neighborhood, other Barberton residents, the Community Foundation, SUMA, obviously the City of Barberton, Fire Department, Connect Church, and many more. And with that, Habitat is going to give the city $2,000 to be spent on College Park. So that's a nice little bonus there.
Nice.
Over here downtown, the First Street parking lot next to the Community Foundation behind Al's Market is being repaved. So they started grinding it up today, and this is in connection with the stormwater mitigation features that we installed earlier this year. So that parking lot has been needing to be repaired for quite a while, resurfaced, but we want to put in some stormwater features first, mitigation features, which we did. So that's going on now. I do want to address, there was a post on social media about the status of Worcester Road West and the reconstruction there. So this project is partially funded by a grant through the federal government. Several years ago, 5 or 6 years ago, we applied for it through City Council. We fought. We had to meet with ODOT and others to get this grant. So we were able to get it. The money's just coming due now. So the federal government's paying for approximately 80% of this cost. The money is coming from the federal gas tax, but the way it works, it runs through the state of Ohio. And so ODOT is running the project, similar to Snyder Avenue, Hopkinton Avenue, Norton Avenue, West State Street, and Worcester Road North. So the comment alluded to that the project hasn't started yet. And even though the project for the physical construction or reconstruction hasn't gone to bid yet, the project has started. So I just want to make that clear. So it's a total reconstruction. So there's property acquisition. We've been working with the railroad for the crossing there by 14th Street. Tons of engineering, checking the storm lines and other utilities. Remember, this is a reconstruction project, not a resurfacing project. If you think of, just because it's not in the public eye doesn't necessarily mean that the project hasn't started. And I know a lot of people think that a reconstruction like a resurfacing is when they start tearing up the road. That'll happen. But just because it's not kind of in the public eye doesn't mean the project hasn't started. This isn't a resurfacing, it's a reconstruction. So there's a lot that goes into that. Does anyone have any questions on that? I just want to make sure everyone's clear that, Barberton hasn't had a lot of total reconstruction projects over the years. And so this is kind of new for a lot of people, but I want to make sure that they understand it's different than a resurfacing. Yes?
Is there a way to get some of that information out? I mean, I know we don't want to get ahead of ourselves, but just let people know that, like you said, there's property acquisition, there's engineering, that has to be looked at and plans formulated before the actual work starts. So that way you don't have a lot of people going on Facebook and, being keyboard warriors and, oh, when is this going to start? And why aren't they working on it? Oh, we hear this is going to start, and it kind of cuts back on that, you know, because they see, okay, this is where it's gonna start, this is an ODOT project, so we're not gonna see like a normal street resurfacing, this is a whole, you know, like what they're doing at Worcester or State Street.
Right.
You know, and just kind of like, you know, post it with, you know, the community groups and, you know, the city page, and that way you kind of keep people updated so they see it's a step-by-step project.
Right. And a lot of people see the word ODOT and think that it's a state route, and it's not.
Yeah.
And, you know, crazy enough, you know, we try to communicate with the community pages, and they don't share our stuff, so they're not truly community pages, which is a shame. But we do post it on our social media. I've done videos on it, but we want to keep that going, just kind of beat people over the head with it. So.
Question. The good days before social media and when people wouldn't have accusations, what was the best way to get these communications out, like newspaper?
Yes.
Okay. I was just curious.
Yeah, so, and, you know, so
Nobody
we're doing
gets
that
it.
again. It's just, you know, there's I believe when I was on city council, there was one reconstruction project. And we've been very, very diligent and working very hard to get this money. That's over a mile stretch of roadway there. That's, depending on where you're at, that's 3 or 4 lanes. It kind of does this. So there's a lot that goes into it, but, you know, it's just not going to be that mill and fill. It's going to take a while, and people are going to be upset. We kind of jokingly said years ago, like, man, people are going to go from complaining about the street to complaining about the detours. That's what's happening. So we try to get that information out, and it's going to take some time. But to your point, we'll continue to put that out. Do you have a question?
No, I had an answer. She asked how you were going to get the word out to people.
Yes.
On Worcester Road West, I live over there, so I've been kind of keeping track of how many different trucks are running cables underground to look at the water lines and things like that. So it may not look like they're doing anything, but we have cameras, we have the gas company over there. If you walk up and down, the sidewalks are all green and yellow and blue arrows. So, you know, other than going out and taking a picture of the guys doing that work, and that's initial work, right?
Yeah, and that's been going on for quite a while.
Yeah.
And it's very similar to South Van Buren. That's not as long as Worcester Road, but, you know, they've gone out there, they've done engineering. People see people doing work and they get excited, which they should, but then they may not see anyone for a number of weeks or a month, and they figure, oh, it's not going to happen. Well, there's a lot that goes into these. So very different than what's happening on Norton Avenue or Snyder or West Hopkinton, where it's just kind of a mill and fill. So, any other questions? Yes.
Thank you, Mayor. Given the length of Worcester Road West, and I don't know if it's been decided yet, but in the plans when it finally starts, the physical work starts, do they plan on doing it sections at a time or trying to do one side, like one side bound, then the other side? Or, again, I don't know if that's been decided, what kind of approach they're going to take to such a main road that goes that far.
I'm not exactly sure. That's one of the things we're looking into, but also where are they going to start? You know, closer to 4th Street or Hudson Road. With so many residents and businesses and bus route, and you got school, and there's so much traffic through there. I forget the count. That's something that's definitely going to be considered as we continue moving forward.
Thank you.
And we'll get this information out as it comes through. The great thing is ODOT's running the project. They bid it, they do all that kind of legwork, which we don't have to, right? So that's part of the project. The bad thing is they run the project. So if it's going to stop, you know, we're at their mercy, right? So hard to give up 80% on a $11 million project. Right? Yes.
I wanted to ask, because this is similar, although Worcester Road is a bigger project. Do you remember how long it took to do the 31st Street reconstruction?
Oh,
that was a mess.
That was a mess for a number of years because they were working in different sections. The crew would be working in Norton and Barberton at the same time, and then only in one community. Yeah, that took a while.
Right.
And I know property acquisition held that up quite a while as well.
Right. So it'll be maybe that long if we
Yeah,
run into any
probably a
problems,
good
yeah.
year.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Anything else? All right, Saturday, I was honored to go out and celebrate 70 years of Malco Products. Great company, still family-owned, so thank you to them for being here in Barberton. And one of the things I mentioned at that celebration was a lot is going on in 70 years. You talk about manufacturing, you talk about different standards, you talk about logistics, and then you think about all that stuff's relevant just in the last 5 years, right? So a lot of things that they've had to endure. And so my hat goes off to companies that have a lot of longevity to their kind of portfolio there. So also on this weekend, Leach's Meats and Sweets held their annual Ray Leach Senior Luncheon, which benefits Backham and SRI and Shoe Fund. Something that we support on a monthly basis as well. If you knew Ray Leach Sr. or the Leach family, you know how much they give back to the community and they care. One thing about Ray Leach Sr., just like his son, they don't forget names or faces.
No, they don't.
Kind of like police officers or teachers, they know everyone. It's like you walk in, they know, they're already cutting up what you usually get. So another great business in town. 2 more things. My open office hours are this Saturday from 9 to 11 a.m. at the Active Adult Center. And then Change for Change is September 28th at the Barberton Leader Toffel benefiting victim assistance. That's all I have unless there's any questions. All right, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. President. This Saturday, we're having another community picnic. It's 470 Bell Street, corner of Bell and Haven. It's sponsored by the New and Living Way Church, and hours are 12 to 5 p.m. And I'll already talked to the mosquito abatement people. They're going to spray the area so the bugs won't bite you. And everything's free, and the feedback from our residents on the newly asphalted streets has been phenomenal. So we all invited to attend and enjoy.
Thank you, Mr. Griffin. With nothing else, do I have a motion to adjourn? Mr. Heidick?
Thank you, Mr. President. I'll make the motion to adjourn.
Thank you. Is there a second? Mrs. Thompson?
Thank you, Mr. President. I will second that motion.
Thank you. It was moved by Mr. Heidick and seconded by Mrs. Thompson that we adjourn. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed? Didn't think so. This meeting is adjourned at 6:52 p.m.
Wow.